And then for our final topic, we have the somewhat curious inclusion of an ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services technology, in what has otherwise been an entire objective and module here on RRAS. I say curious because Microsoft has, with the R2 content, introduced quite a bigger focus on ADFS-related topics in this, the 7411, as well as in the 7412, and again in the 7414. So what this illustrates is that Microsoft wants you to know at least some of the aspects of Active Directory Federation services. However, the way in which this content is included in these three different exams is a bit strange considering the ways in which ADFS typically gets used. Here in the 70-411, we are looking at one very simple, very introductory, almost not ADFS at all incorporation of ADFS technologies, and that is the Web Application Proxy, which you can see right there. Now, the Web Application Proxy is essentially a reverse proxy that sits outside your firewall between you and the rest of the internet, the rest of the world, that provides a mechanism to essentially set a device in front of your internal applications, those that you might see down here. These are most commonly web applications. I mean, it is called the Web Application Proxy. And the point here is that when you have an application that sits on the inside, there needs to be some way of protecting it from the outside world, yet still allowing people to connect in, still allowing people to authenticate, still allowing people to make use of that application if they can get through the firewall in a way that you approve their use. Well, this implementation of the Web Application Proxy in what it terms pass-through mode is effectively the least, I'll say, secure of the three options that exist. And this is predominantly because in pass-through mode, the Web Application Proxy essentially uses the already existing authentication mechanism that's in the application itself in order to authenticate the incoming user. So a proxy in pass-through mode doesn't do much other than just simply proxy the content to the inside. Now, in order to do this, you do have to have, as you can see over here, an Active Directory Federation server as well. And for us to be able to set up a web application proxy, even just to see the most basic of web pages, you have to have at least two servers. One on the inside, which is an ADFS server. That's a domain joined machine that sits right in your Active Directory domain. And then a second machine, which is typically in a work group, located out in a DMZ somewhere, out on the other side of your firewall. I think for the purposes of this exam, if you know that there are two machines you need to have and that one's domain joined and one is not, and one's inside the firewall and one is outside, that is probably the most detail I think that Microsoft would require you to know for the implementation of a web application proxy. However, that said, I think it's worthwhile for us to at least spend a minute looking at the implementation and use of a web application proxy, if anything, just to give you an appreciation for the different pieces that need to be laid into place. So here I am back on one of my machines here. This is a dc.company.pri. This is our domain controller. It also happens to be the machine where we've installed Active Directory certificate services, and if I come down here, I can show you that I've used the Add Roles and Features wizard to go through installing the Federation service onto this machine as well, so AD Federation services. With AD Federation services on this machine, again, this is the domain joined machine that is acting both as our domain controller and our ADFS machine. Let's go through the implementation of the Federation service on this machine. I should tell you also that if I go down here to our certificates view, I've already installed a wildcard certificate onto this machine, star.company.pri. This wildcard certificate, one that has an exportable private key, I've added to this machine because it's this wildcard certificate, both here on the DC as well as over on our web application proxy over in a work group, that facilitates the authentication between these two machines. With there being no Active Directory extended into both locations, we have to have some way of authenticating one machine to another, and it's exactly this certificate that will support that functionality. So this certificate's been created and then installed onto those two machines. Again, as I mentioned before in this module, anything having to do with certificates is something I'm going to punt until the 70-412 content, because the creation of certificate templates and the enrollment of certificates is something you really don't actually have to know here for this specific exam. So let's go through that process now of configuring the Federation service on this machine. And we will create the first Federation server in a Federation server farm. Most often you end up configuring these in pairs or more so that you can support functionality should you lose one of your domain controllers or other servers. But we'll just create a single server here in our Federation server farm and use my account here as the account with domain admin privileges to complete the Federation service configuration. It's here where we need to identify then the SSL certificate that we'll use for actually creating our Federation services farm and facilitating that communication. The Federation service name here, as you can see, is now configured to be star.company.pri, but I'm going to replace this to say fs.company.pri and change the same thing down here, fs.company.pri, so that I don't end up having that wildcard appearing in my Federation service name. You'll see why that's important here in just a second. I'll choose Next here, and then rather than going through the extra effort of creating a managed service account, which in a production world is a better implementation of an Active Directory Federation service, let's just go through and use a regular domain user account. Now, don't do this in production, obviously, because using your own user account is something you just don't want to do. But in a production world, a managed service account provides a way for Active Directory to manage the different characteristics of the account and its password. I'll choose Next here, and in the next screen here is where we can identify what database we'll use for ADFS. Because this is a small instance, we'll just use the Windows internal database. The usual caveats apply here for the use of SQL, its abilities to be backed up and replicated and whatnot. So use SQL Server if you're in a production world. I'll choose Next again to review those options that I've configured, Next again, and then Configure to go about configuring Active Directory Federation services. And this process takes just a couple of minutes. So I'll accelerate things here to the final step in the installation. Notice here that we've configured this server, and there's really not much to see here. I can close the view here and hit Close again, and then bring up under the Tools tab the Active Directory Federation Services console here, which you'll find under ADFS Management right here at the top. Now, one of the things that's kind of curious about this implementation of the web application proxy is that your ADFS console is not even really necessary for the configuration of the proxy in pass-through mode. I'm just showing you the ADFS console here because you'll see it again in the 412 and again in the 414 exam as we go through that content. Our next step in this process actually happens not on this machine DC, but instead over here on the server that we'll use as our web application proxy. Now, you'll notice that the server we're using here is actually a domain joined machine. I'm kind of cheating here because we already have the remote access role installed onto this machine remote 1. We couldn't install it into a workgroup because in order to do so, you have to have access to a radius server, which we don't have set up just yet. So for our purposes here, let's just pretend that this is in a workgroup as opposed to in a domain. We're also using remote 1 here because, and this is really one of the reasons why the web application proxy is in this objective on RRAS, is because the proxy itself, if we come over here to the dashboard and take a look at the All Add Roles and Features wizard, the proxy itself is actually a component of the remote access role that we installed earlier in this module. As you can see down here, earlier in this module, we installed the direct access and VPN, the routing, and also the web application proxy role services onto this machine, which means that we can actually install the web application proxy here onto the computer by going back up here under Tools and then revisiting our remote access management view right here. This remote access management view we looked at it only very shortly when we first implemented RRAS back very early in this course. Remote access is the place where you kind of light up the VPN component. It's also the place where you can turn on the web application proxy. It's also where you can turn on direct access, and in fact where we will in our module coming up. But over here, when we install VPN, we kind of skipped over the fact that the web application proxy exists here. Well, let's go through now and run the web application proxy configuration wizard to get this whole thing set up. This wizard is relatively trivial. All we have to do really is connect up the web application proxy to our Federation server using that same Federation service name we configured before, fs.company.pri, and then a user with the credentials that can actually get the thing configured, so company, G-Shields, and my password. I mentioned before that in order to do this, we have to have a certificate, and we had a wildcard certificate that we installed over on our domain controller. Well, I've made a copy of that wildcard certificate and brought it over here onto this computer as well. Right here is a copy of that certificate, and I've gone through installing that certificate, just the same cert with the same private key. It's also a wildcard cert here onto this other machine, Remote 1. With that certificate on this machine, we can now access that certificate by choosing it here in the chooser. There's star.company.pri. If I choose Next and then Configure, this should go through the process of configuring the web application proxy. Let me choose Configure here. Now, one of the things you have to know whenever you're going through all this configuration between the outside portion and the inside portion is in making sure that you have the appropriate name resolution for all the different servers that are participating. Now, because this web application proxy is designed to exist off the network and away from your internal DNS services, that federation service name that we configured just a second ago needs to be input in somehow on these different servers in some way so that we can resolve them appropriately. Now, that's not something that gets automatically created in DNS. Again, remember, we're dealing with machines that are outside the domain. So I want to show you that here on this machine, I've actually gone through in that same location for my hosts file and configured this hosts file with another little cheat down here where I've included the fs.company.pri fully qualified domain name and attached it to the IP address, the internal address for my server 192.168.0.100. That is dc.company.pri. I'll also show you here in just a second when we get to our client, so that the desktop that we'll be using. On that desktop, we've done the same thing, except in the case of the desktop, we've not pointed it to the inside server, but instead to the proxy server, this outside machine, Remote 1. Now, this is necessary because the machines on the outside are going to essentially be resolving this federation service name from the outside world. So you'll have to think about exactly where you want these different names to resolve to, depending on what location you may be in. But as you can see here, because we've configured these appropriately, the web application proxy has now been configured successfully on this machine. And now we can see that we have a list, or will eventually have a list, of those published web applications that we can make available through the proxy.